Mara and Junie had been sleeping behind the laundromat on 5th for 3 weeks when the notice caught Mara's eye, stapled to a pole and curling at the edges in the rain. Free to anyone who will take IT. House must be moved or cleared by month's end. Below the words was an address past the train tracks, where nobody with money ever bothered to look. It's probably falling down, Junie said, hugging her knees on the cold concrete. She was 19, 2 years younger than Mara, and had learned to expect the worst before it arrived, so it would hurt less when it did. Everything we've got is falling down, Mara said. At least this one would have a roof. They walked the 4 miles that afternoon, taking turns carrying the one duffel bag that held everything they owned. The house, when they found it, leaned so far to the left that it seemed to be listening for something in the ground. The porch sagged like a tired mouth. Ivy had swallowed one whole side of it, and a shutter hung from a single hinge, tapping against the siding whenever the wind picked up. Nobody had lived there in years. The town had condemned it, then forgotten about it, then simply let it rot in peace on its overgrown lot, because tearing it down cost money nobody wanted to spend on a house nobody wanted. Home sweet home, she said, and Junie almost laughed, because laughing was better than crying, and because they hadn't had a door to close behind them in a very long time. They called the number on the flyer that same day from a payphone outside the gas station, and a tired-sounding man named Robert Voss told them the county would let anyone take the place off their hands, no questions asked, so long as they signed a form promising not to sue if it fell down around their ears. Mara signed it with a pen borrowed from the gas station clerk. It felt like the first thing she had owned outright in years. The first month was a war against neglect. They swept a decade of dead leaves out of the front hall. They found a family of raccoons living in the pantry and, after a standoff involving a broom and a great deal of screaming, negotiated a peaceful withdrawal. They patched the roof with tarps scavenged from a construction site 2 streets over, weighing the corners down with bricks so the wind couldn't peel them back. At night they slept in the front room, on a mattress dragged in from a dumpster, listening to the house creak and settle like an old man getting comfortable in a chair. It was Junie who noticed the floor didn't sound right. She was 17 days into learning the house. She had started thinking of it that way, learning it, the way you'd learn a person, when she noticed that the boards in the back bedroom rang hollow under her heel in a way the boards in the hallway didn't. She mentioned it to Mara over a dinner of crackers and peanut butter, and Mara, who by then trusted her sister's instincts more than she trusted most things, went and got the crowbar they'd found in the shed. It took them an hour to pry up 3 boards without cracking them, working carefully because good lumber was worth something and they had learned, on the street, never to waste what could be sold or used. Underneath was not, as Junie had half hoped and half feared, a body, or a bomb, or anything from the stories people told about old houses. It was a space, maybe 2 feet deep, lined with tar paper gone brittle with age, and inside it were 3 metal boxes stacked one on top of the other, the kind with a hinged lid and a little brass latch, the kind people used before anyone trusted banks the way they do now. Inside the first box were letters, dozens of them, tied in bundles with string that had gone the color of weak tea. Inside the second were photographs, brittle at the corners, of a woman standing in front of the very house they were sitting in, when its paint had been fresh and its porch had stood up straight. Inside the third box, wrapped in a linen handkerchief, was a small leather ledger and a stack of old savings bonds, along with a note in careful, slanting handwriting that had clearly been written by someone who expected it might be read by a stranger. The note explained, in a few short paragraphs, that the house had belonged to a woman named Eleanor Voss, no relation, it turned out, to Robert who'd signed the papers, just a coincidence of a common name in a small town, who had raised 3 children alone in that house after her husband didn't come home from the war. She had never trusted banks after losing everything once in a crash she never fully explained, and so she had kept what she could save hidden beneath her own bedroom floor, box by box, year by year, meaning it as a nest egg for whichever of her children needed it most. But her children had scattered before she died, and the ledger's last entry, in a hand grown shaky with age, simply said, "For whoever finds this and needs it more than my own blood ever came back to ask." Mara read it twice before she could speak. She wanted somebody to have it, Junie said quietly. Somebody who needed it. They took the bonds to the bank in town 2 days later, a little afraid the whole time that someone would tell them the money wasn't theirs, that they'd have to hand it over to a stranger with a better claim, or to the county, or to nobody at all. But the bank manager, an older woman who remembered Eleanor Voss from her own childhood, told them plainly that after this many decades, with no living heirs on record and the note explicit as it was, the bonds and the small collected interest belonged to whoever held the house and the ledger, which was, as of a signed county form and an act of pure stubborn hope, the 2 of them. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't the kind of money that ends a story with a private island. But it was enough to fix the roof properly, enough to run water to the kitchen again, enough to buy real beds and a stove that worked and 2 winter coats that weren't handed down from a shelter bin. Enough, most of all, to turn a crooked house nobody wanted into the first place either of them had ever been able to call theirs without flinching. They kept Eleanor's photographs on the mantel once they'd built one back up out of salvaged brick. Junie liked to imagine, some nights, that the old woman was glad someone had finally needed her house the way she'd needed it once. Mara didn't put much stock in ghosts, but she liked the story anyway, and she liked that whether or not Eleanor Voss was watching from anywhere at all, the promise in that shaky handwriting had finally been kept. The house still leaned a little to the left. They never quite managed to fix that, and after a while they stopped trying, because a straight house didn't feel like theirs anymore. It felt like the crooked one that had taken them in when nothing else would, and that was worth more to them than square corners ever could be. Word got around town the way it does in small places, and within a week half the county knew the crooked house on the edge of town had given up some kind of secret. A few people came by out of curiosity, standing at the end of the drive, trying to get a look without seeming too obvious about it. 1 or 2 asked outright whether the sisters meant to sell, now that they had money and a house worth something again. Mara always gave the same answer. No. Not now. Maybe not ever. Robert Voss came around one afternoon, apologizing for the coincidence of names that had confused people at the bank, and admitted he'd walked past that house 100 times as a boy, always wondering who'd lived there before it went to ruin. Junie showed him the photographs, and he studied Eleanor's face a long moment before saying she looked like the kind of woman his own grandmother would have called unbending, and glad of it. Old habits from the street didn't disappear just because there was a roof overhead. Junie still woke some nights sure the walls were about to be taken from her, and she'd sit up counting the corners of the room until her breathing slowed. Mara caught herself hoarding things out of instinct, cans stacked deep in a cupboard, blankets hidden in a closet, long after there was any reason to fear running out. Surviving something, they were learning, doesn't end the moment the danger does. It just changes shape and moves in quietly. But little by little, the house did its work on them the way they'd done theirs on it. The porch got straightened, if not the whole frame. The garden gave up a rhubarb patch nobody had planted and a rosebush that bloomed every June anyway. Neighbors who'd ignored the place for a decade began waving from the road, and one brought a casserole the week the water started running properly. By the spring, there was a new flyer on the telephone pole outside the laundromat on 5th. It wasn't about a house this time. It was a flyer the sisters had made themselves, offering a spare room, free for now, to whoever needed it more than they still needed all of it themselves.